Hello, I'm David Judson, Editor-in-Chief of Stratfor. Today with us is an interesting guest, an unusual guest for Stratfor, frankly.
Just an unusual guest in general, yeah.
Just an unusual guest, not at all. But the Daniel Oppenheimer, who is the author of Exit Right, which is a book on six figures who moved from the left of American politics to the right throughout history. But for us here at Stratfor, it's an interesting and relevant book, I think, because it's through the lens of these six intellectuals that you really looked at the long war from World War II through the end of the Cold War in 1989. So maybe you could tell us a little about these six and why you chose. Some of the names will be familiar to our readers and some may be kind of abstract.
Yeah, so the six are Whittaker Chambers, and I'll sort of go back and kind of explain who they were. Whittaker Chambers, James Burnham, Ronald Reagan, Norman Podhoretz, David Horowitz, and Christopher Hitchens. So Chambers was kind of not so well known today, but was a kind of big figure in his time. He became a communist in the 1920s, was briefly a sort of popular writer of communist-inspired fiction, was the editor of New Masses, which was the Communist Party literary journal, and then was tapped to be part of the communist underground. So for most of the 1930s, he was a communist spy, first in New York and then in D.C., and at the end of the 30s, he broke with the party, came out the other side, a sort of convinced anti-communist, became famous through the series of hearings and trials in which he testified against Alger Hiss, who was a former State Department official who had been part of one of his spy rings, though the trials were because Hiss insisted that he was not, had never been a communist.
The pumpkin patch.
Yeah, right,
Yes,
right, exactly.
Patch, yes.
And then he became one of the founding editors of National Review, and he wrote an autobiography, Witness, which became kind of one of the canonical texts of 20th century American conservatism and anti-communism, and was an influence on all sorts of figures going forward, including Ronald Reagan. James Burnham was a Trotskyist in the 1930s, became an anti-communist, was also a founding editor of William F. Buckley's National Review, a foreign policy thinker and theorist. Ronald Reagan, of course, was not a lefty, but was a New Deal Roosevelt liberal up through the end of the 1940s, when he started his sort of long shift toward conservatism. Norman Podhoretz became kind of known to the world as a literary critic and writer, was the editor of Commentary magazine in the early 1960s when he ran it as a kind of left liberal magazine, and then himself had a transition towards the right and became one of the godfathers of neoconservatism, and brought Commentary with him. David Horowitz was a early New Left activist and thinker, and was solidly on the left until the 1970s when he had a real traumatic break because a woman whom he'd recommended for a job with the Black Panthers in Oakland was killed, probably by the Panthers, and he fell apart for about 5 years and came out the other side, sort of convinced that the left was the greatest threat to the health of the Union. And Christopher Hitchens, who's probably the most familiar to most folks, who was a socialist for most of his life, and I think never went all the way over to the right, but certainly very decisively left the left and left the family and community of the left kind of after 9/11 and in the run-up to the Iraq War.
Yeah, no, it's as I say, it's a remarkable choice of people who you sort of got into the heads of all of them to, well, I don't know, we were chatting earlier, I don't know if we got into the head of Ronald Reagan, but with the others, you're certainly a great deal of empathetic analysis. But I think that, one of the takeaways from the perspective of Stratfor is, the fluidity of ideology and the fluidity of political commitment. And can you take that to the present when we see this sort of fracturing of old paradigms? Obviously the world is talking about Donald Trump, but we have on the left, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon in American politics as well. That things are changing rapidly, and our tools to analyze this are not as useful as they once were.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I'd say a few things. I'd say one is that the people I'm writing about in the book are kind of extreme examples to the extent that they're people who lived their politics kind of, down to the core of their very being. So in certain ways, their politics are less easily fluid. I think the truth is that people lose sight of. The truth is that for most of us who are not full-time political people in one way or another, a lot of times it's not that our politics aren't deeply felt, but the ideas behind them aren't deeply held or sort of integrated. And so what that can create is a situation, particularly when you're in a moment of crisis or what feels like crisis, is that it's not that the feelings go away, but the form that they take, the sort of concrete form and the ideological form that they take, can shift very rapidly. And I think that's particularly true. And you had mentioned before, that there's people who are now saying, well, if Bernie doesn't get the nomination, maybe I'll go vote for Trump. At least that's a fear. And I think, it's probably an overstated fear, but to the extent that there's truth in it, it's because Bernie speaks to certain things in people that resonate, and the kind of superstructure of ideas behind that is not coherent in some well-articulated left-wing or democratic socialist way. It's certain things they're feeling about how the nation has gone wrong, or people are getting screwed, or the 1% or the elites are sort of bending us all to their will, and that impulse can be given sort of a more ostensibly conservative form very quickly if the right kind of circumstances present themselves.
Yeah, I know, Daniel. Your world is domestic politics, and ours really is global geopolitics. But it seems to me that there's a connectivity here between what's happening globally in so many situations where we have the extreme right to a sense, to a degree, and the extreme left to a degree in Athens, teaming up against the center. Similar kinds of dynamics in Spain. France, anybody's guess. India is an interesting example. That is this fracturing of old political slots and structures strictly a domestic thing that we're seeing, or can we analogize from what we're going through here through the American campaign season to broader global trends?
I mean, so I want to be careful not to exceed the limits of my expertise, but I'll just talk anyway.
We'll draw you in that direction.
I think one of the things that occurred to me as I was researching this book is how quickly sometimes it can seem, at least when you're looking back in sort of historical retrospect, things just sort of change profoundly, right? So talking about, now I think that it's sort of conventional wisdom that, that the sort of decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire kind of laid the groundwork for an enormous amount of the conflict that ensued in the fall of the British Empire, and so that these things that seem permanent and eternal and stable can very quickly just sort of dissolve in incredibly sort of threatening and profound and catastrophic ways. And it's, so researching the book has attuned me to that, and it may be the case, and I'm sure I'm not the first or the 15,000th person to say this, that, that at the end of the Cold War, that we're still kind of dealing with sort of realignment or reorientation in the aftermath of this extraordinary global struggle that conditioned politics, in most of the world for 50 years, for 40 years. And I think I was struck in the book at the extent to which, it still does in a way. And then the habits of thought that were formed during that period are still with us and still conditioning our politics. So I don't know what's coming any more than anybody else, but when I see these kind of realignments and this fluidity, I don't think it's crazy to start talking about, Weimar Germany or sort of comparable examples and this possibility that we might be in a moment of kind of incipient crisis or catastrophe.
Sure. Sobering thought. I do want to get back to something even perhaps a bit more abstract, but close to home at Stratfor, and that's that one of the figures whose life and times you examined was Burnham's, and part of his crisis, if I can call it that sort of began his political journey or migration, was his struggle with predictive analysis. Which is kind of what we do for a living, and we spend as much time second-guessing our analysis. And
his attraction to and struggle with it,
what is the takeaway about predictive analysis from your study of Burnham that we might take a lesson from here?
I want to say don't do it.
Don't do it.
So Burnham, so I think what attracted to him, he was somebody like so many American intellectuals trying to kind of find purchase, when the ground fell out beneath us during the Great Depression. But I think also temperamentally was attracted to a kind of, a sort of total theory of the world, and Marxism was the one that drew him in initially, and it offered not just a means of kind of understanding the world and what was happening, but also, for those who chose to see it in this light, a way of predicting what was coming. He ended up breaking with Marxism, in no small part because, the distance between what his Marxism led him to predict and what was actually happening grew so broad that it ended up kind of collapsing his whole attachment to the system, which he recognized with respect to Marxism, though the irony being that he then went on to kind of adopt a less sort of defined in a way, but another system of prediction. He became no more sort of humble or sort of self-doubting with respect to the sort of human capacity for prediction, and in certain ways became kind of notorious for confidently making assertions that would then be disproved a few years later. And I think the lesson I draw from him is not that we shouldn't make predictions and not that we shouldn't try to look into the future to the best of our ability, but we should do that with a great deal of sort of humility about the possibility for that, and really wrestle, as it sounds like you all do, with kind of what is it that can be gleaned and gained from doing that boldly, confidently, but also with that sense of introspection. What is that? And that's a hard thing to articulate. What is it precisely that you're gaining from that? Because it's real. It's what we do in our lives, right? It's what we do when we acquire experience, and what we like to call wisdom and maturity is we're taking all the data that we have and we're making some assumptions about what's likely to be a case going forward. Maturity and wisdom are real. It's very hard to sort of define exactly what they are, but I think it's probably, to your point about how Stratfor approaches it, it's probably a process more than it is, an expectation of arriving at a landing point.
Sure, no, but it's just the sort of cautionary note about humility. Our track record is good, but I think that the admonition to constantly be reflecting upon your methodology and how you do that is from a very different context than the one we operate in is nonetheless useful.
I think the last line before the postscript, I might be right about this, that the last line of the book, and I'm talking about Christopher Hitchens, who also in his own way tried to come up with a system, and it was a very idiosyncratic system, but it was a system not as if predicting history, but for getting history right as a sort of moral and political actor. And he sort of had devoted an enormous amount of intellectual and personal energy to developing his system, which I believe failed him in the case of the Iraq War. I think literally the last line of the book before the postscript is, you can check, there's no perfect refuge anywhere.
Right.
And that was this person who had dedicated so much energy to try and avoid making the mistakes that other systems and approaches had made, and even that failed him.
Yes, even Václav Havel can be wrong. Even George Orwell, it turns out, can be wrong. Or we can be wrong about Orwell. There's no perfect refuge anywhere. So we'll close on that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Exit Right, Daniel Oppenheimer. Delighted you're here. Thank you for joining us here at Stratfor.
Thanks, David.